As a soulless virus spread, vulnerability and disparity bred. A nation that can lead the way, guided by head and gilded by heart. Alas, saw the divide rip further apart. To rise above prejudice and give way to justice. To embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Good morning, everyone. And a few house rules before we begin our session for today. Everyone, please do identify yourselves by customizing your name first, followed by your organization. To ensure that our speakers are clearly heard and seen, we have disabled your mics and videos. We will have them on during the Q&A session. Don't be worried about that. Please note that the session is being recorded and is being streamed online. And so any questions or comments that might be shared during the session will also be streamlined and shared. We do request you to please respect the privacy of the speakers when they're speaking and refrain from sending them personal messages, but please do connect with them later on. We also invite you to please use the chat feature to ask questions and participate while the discussions are going on and also while the Q&A session is on. We have our folks on the back end ensuring that our questions are taken into consideration and then put forth during the Q&A session. And of course, should you have any trouble with technology, please do share that with the Dasra host and we'll try to fix it ASAP. And last but not the least, please do use the following hashtags on your screen to share your thoughts on social media. And so, with that, again, a very, very good morning to all of you and welcome to the 12th annual Dasra Philanthropy Week. Thank you so much for taking out the time to join us, not only today, but throughout this week. The theme for this year's forum is A Billion Thriving. And DPW marks the beginning of this movement that each one of us must make our own. If there's one thought that we would like you to walk away with through our dialogues across this week, it is that we urgently need to shift conversations in philanthropy from surviving to thriving. And we can enable our most vulnerable to thrive only when we embrace a strong Jedi lens. And by Jedi, we mean justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all our work. Through the week, we hope you will engage in our live learning lab discussions, the daily philanthropy beat, which promises to hit your inbox every morning, and connect with each other to spark discussions that are idea focused, inspiring, and action oriented that ultimately drive conversations that matter. There has never been a more important time than now to come together and drive these important dialogues. So, thank you once again for joining us at DPW 2021. And welcome to the very, very first session, It's Time to Talk, where Deval will be in conversation with esteemed Indian film director, writer, and producer Hansal Mehta, who's also been a longtime friend of Dasra's, as they launch Deval's new podcast, No Cost Extension. which will promise to drive honest conversations to unpack the mechanics of social change with various Indian development sector leaders. Here's a quick trailer before we dive into the conversation.
which led me and my wife to create a strategic. Hi, my name is Deval Sangvi. 21 years ago, I moved to India to volunteer with organizations. Through these experiences, I learned about the complexities of the development sector and requirement for flexible but long-term strategies which support the communities and their ever-changing needs. I also realized that limited knowledge and trust existed between the giver and the receiver, which led me and my wife to create a strategic philanthropy foundation called Dasra. These past 2 decades in India have been like none other. We've seen the emergence of new family foundations. Indian nonprofit organizations have scaled throughout India and globally, and innovations in funding, including microfinance, impact investing, and development impact bonds, continuously change the landscape. But is this all just old wine in a new bottle? Because even today, the inequality gap continues to widen. Community voices are not heard, and those who have access to capital at times seem to think more of their ego than empowerment. At the heart of our efforts, aren't we all trying to build for the future so that one day we can live in a world where everyone can thrive? I've met some extraordinary people who have actively shaped the development sector and my thinking about the world. Conversations with them have kept me going all these years, and I felt it was time to share these conversations with you. Join me, Deval Sangvi, on No Cost Extension, my new podcast, which will give you a first-hand glimpse of India's development sector from the individuals who are actively shaping. I will be speaking to community and NGO leaders, as well as funders, about breaking down walls and pivotal moments in their journeys. And I promise you, while we will talk about successes, we will also question our notions of progress and power, and speak candidly about failures and where we as a sector have fallen short. No Cost Extension is produced by Vaca Media and launches in March 2021. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, go to dasra.org and follow me on Twitter at Deval_Sangvi.
Good morning, Deval.
Good morning, Hansal Bhai.
So, this was, a very unusual request. I would have expected you to have Safina interview you, but I'm delighted to be on this forum talking to you because, I must tell you that 2008 is when we got to know about Dasra, when we got to know Neera and you, and your presence in our life, as individuals and as Dasra has been transformative. You, an organization that was doing a pilot with only 50 schools, has scaled to a level that we never imagined. It was an organization on the verge of, possible shutdown, and from a place of despair, you have scaled us to a place of transformation. And, while I'm very, very thankful to you for that, I think I'm more thankful that as individuals, as an organization, you guys have transformed our lives. As a filmmaker, many of the things that I, many of the experiences that I live on screen are part of our conversations, and I'm hoping that this conversation takes that forward. Your podcast takes those conversations forward and helps us tell these important stories to the world. So yes, welcome, Deval, and welcome to your new podcast, No Cost Extension. What is this no cost extension? I was quite intrigued, and I did not want to prepare for this talk or ask you beforehand. So tell me, what is this?
No, thank you, Hansel. And I am interviewing your wife later for the podcast. And so don't worry. Safina is very much in the mix. And hers and other stories, again, like you said, are so inspirational that I think it's hopefully this is a platform that we can get those stories out there more so than we've had in the past. I think one of the reasons we've titled this No Cost Extension is because it's a terminology that is actually quite understood in the nonprofit sector. And what it means is typically when you get funding from a larger foundation, for example, they'll give you funding for, let's say, a 3-year or 5-year period. And in that contract, they will say if you don't spend those funds within this time period, they'll give you something called a no cost extension, which means they'll give you sort of a few weeks or months or years even just to spend that additional amount. And I think the reason we decided to sort of call this podcast No Cost Extension is because typically two things. I guess number one, typically organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, we've done things efficiently, which is why we haven't spent the full capital. And yet donors, and I think it's important to speak about this, not just in today's panel, but more importantly in our podcast, donors at times clearly have the power. And so while that terminology, no cost extension, seems that they're doing NGOs a favor, it really means that NGOs need to continue to deliver on programs with only partial funding, yet donors consider it an extension they're giving us as NGO leaders. And I think, unfortunately, not just the jargon, but this sort of power dynamic, which has been part of this sector for many, many years. The goal of this particular podcast, No Cost Extension, is to speak about those issues, speak openly about them, have candid conversations. At times, again, as NGOs, we are not able to speak about this because we're afraid the donor will not give us these funds. But I think, with everything that's happened in the world in the last year and a half, I think we've all realized now that we need to sort of challenge the norms that exist across the board, including in the development sector. And the no cost extension is just one of these, again, ludicrous things that, again, exist only in the nonprofit sector, that if you're efficient, you actually are given permission to spend the money on a partial basis versus actually saying you should get that as a reward because you've demonstrated sort of impact and success.
Okay. So, Deval, I'm going to just take you back. I just saw the trailer and I realized that it's 21 years since you moved back to India. So, how do you look at this journey? Besides the beard, which makes you look very reflective. So maybe this, reflect on the journey with us. What has it meant for you? And I've always been intrigued. Why the choice to come back to India and to work in a sector that has more challenges than every new achievement is followed by bigger challenges. So why did you choose that?
No, and I think I guess some of this is clearly my upbringing and being born and brought up in the U.S. in a middle-class family. I think we were taught at an early age to look after those who needed support. And so many of these were Indians who came on a flight to Houston, where I was born and brought up in the sort of mid 70s, early 80s. And these individuals had many times place to go. They would sort of land at the airport, and our family, I guess, like many other families across the city, if not the country, would sort of house individuals and get their ready to stand on their 2 feet. And so on one hand, I guess I was exposed to a huge level of support that we were providing individuals who, came from India. Yet when I would come and visit my family here in Mumbai on, every couple of years, and see children who looked like me, who were begging at traffic lights, who had no one to support them. And I'd ask the same parents who were supporting people in America, Indians who came on flights, why aren't we helping? I'd be given answers of, this is not our problem. These children are in gangs. We can't do anything to fix it, ignore. And so I think growing up and seeing sort of children who, again, looked and felt like me, who were in these positions, really frustrated me. And I felt that while I was blessed to have my parents move in the late 60s to the US and give me a better life, I also, I guess, felt an obligation of sorts to sort of see what I can do with that privilege of growing up there, getting educated, getting a job, et cetera, and come back to sort of, help those who I felt people were not helping. And I guess through that process, I volunteered with children living on the streets next to Grant Road Station here in Mumbai with a phenomenal organization, community outreach program. And I guess I just learned so much from them, these kids, than I thought I would teach them. And that was my first exposure, I guess, to this space. And first realization that there's so much we can do as a country, as individuals, and as a society, I guess, to sort of solve these inequalities. And so that led me, I guess, to sort of make the first move and come to India to see if there's anything I can do. Luckily, I met Neera, my wife, as you know, quite well at Morgan Stanley. And we started talking about this at sort of 4 a.m. when we were creating pitch books for our clients, and kept saying, are there skills that we have learned that we can actually take back to India? And so I think that led us to sort of create this organization. I think the beard, and I think it's important to talk about it since it's definitely a conversation in my family. As you can imagine, that happens on a daily basis. I think for me, the reason I have this beard and I haven't, cut or shaved or anything since lockdown is realizing the migrants, the informal workers, those who are the most deprived and vulnerable in our society, those who also pushed me to actually take this plunge and move to India and do something to follow my passion, those communities have continued to be overlooked. And so I guess the introspection, at least at a personal level, was even at Dasra, do we look at the quick fix solutions? Do we look at the scalable models? Are we supporting those who actually need support, who, we may not be able to put on a graph, we may be not able to put it on a results framework like donors want, and the solutions are messy and difficult, but why aren't we, in essence, working with the same communities that at least inspired me to come to India and do this work? So there's definitely been a whole lot of guilt, a whole lot of introspection, and a whole lot of, okay, how can we change our ways? And how do we not forget, again, the communities that build our cities, that feed our children, that honestly has allowed India to be what it is today, and not necessarily take the easy way out when it comes to giving and philanthropy.
So, what does philanthropy mean to you? I mean, how would you define philanthropy? Because I want to take it to my next question, which might be a bit uncomfortable, but before that, the comfortable question.
Sure. And I mean, for me, philanthropy is love for society. And I say that because it's, the hundreds of thousands of field workers that we have across the country, working in government hospitals, working in government schools, working for NGOs. They are more philanthropic, I feel, than many of us. Again, where both of us are sitting comfortably in our apartments right now and have been for the last year. Yet those that are on the ground have not been able to, keep social distancing. They've not been able to sort of live life the way we have. And so for me, I think philanthropy really starts in the bottom. And I think our work at Dasra, anywhere from my first experiences with the children who live on, the streets at Grant Road Station, it was learning more from them about love for society. And what it means. And I think that was a real wake-up call for me in 1996 that, the less you have, the more community-minded perhaps one becomes. And unfortunately, inversely may be true. The more you have, the more singular focus you have with your nuclear family or those from just your community. And I think it's time to sort of change that. And for me, I guess, the original philanthropists clearly that I was inspired by were these kids. I mean, they fed stray animals every single day, even though they didn't have a roof over their heads. They looked after each other. They cared about their community. And I realized very early on that even me growing up in a middle-class family, I didn't treat my own brother with that same level of love for society as I've seen communities treat each other.
So, it takes me to my next question, and this is something that I've always, have seen Safina deal with donors, philanthropists. It's a question that I ask everyone. Do we as Indians, I've seen her working with international donors, international grant agencies, and with Indian donors. Is the culture of giving, does India really have a culture of giving? Are we philanthropic enough? Are philanthropists strategic enough? Or is philanthropy more pressure driven? Because it's something that you need to do. Is it pressure driven? Is it religious? I find myself torn. I find myself often thinking that, philanthropy is not done for the right reasons sometimes in our country. And there are the shining examples are few and far in between. And, how do you bring about that change, because we need to change in order to give.
No, and I think you hit upon a few good points. I think one is, are we as a society in India giving enough? And I think, later this week, we will have multiple discussions just to compare our giving when it comes to certain income strata in India versus giving in other countries. And while that number has gone up over the years, it's still nowhere close to, for example, what we see in the West. And there are many reasons for this, again, including economic growth is still fairly new to India versus in other countries, capital markets, tax incentives. There's a whole host of reasons, I guess. But I think, and for me, I guess the question has always been, not are we as an individual giving enough in terms of how much I can give personally, for example, but more, are we solving the problem or not? And I think when one looks at that, this issue in that frame, I don't think any of us, including myself, Safina, others that we're interviewing who've devoted large portions of their life to be in this space, I don't think any of us actually feel that we've done enough. And I think there are different ways to participate. One can participate, like many of us have been fortunate to do, to sort of devote our lives to this and make this into our jobs and our careers. There's others that may be able to only write checks. And I think, though, it's really important for us to not look at a metric of I'm giving 1% or 0.1% or 0.03%. It needs to be about what is the problem in front of me that we need to solve.
Right.
And I think that's critical. And so for me, I guess it's really starts with that, which is, are we trying to really move people out of poverty and enable them to thrive? Or are we complacent when they survive? And I say this because many of the metrics that globally are looked at in terms of poverty is really mortality rates. Is somebody living or dying? And I've said this many times in various platforms, literacy is defined by whether you could read or write your name, not whether or not you can read and write enough to gain an education, which leads to some sort of employment, or that you can sign documents that you ensure are not cheating you, or that you can read even what's available to you with various government schemes and take action. And so I think the bar, unfortunately, is so low in terms of survival versus thriving societies. And I think we need to change that. And I think once you sort of accept that as the goal, I think then whether it is for social capital, whether it's for legacy, whether it's even religious giving, I mean, there's tons of examples of religious institutions who give to all religions and not just to their community. And again, I'm not saying either or, it's an either or question, but it's a both question, because many times the communities that, for example, the wealthy may come from, there could have been infrastructure, opportunities, a level playing field, which enabled them to become wealthy, which may not exist in other communities. And so it's, I think, looking not just at your communities, but also looking at, India as a whole and saying, okay, well, what are we doing to support India? And I think that in my mind actually is the true meaning of nationalism is about accepting every single person as your own brother, sister, parent, child, versus saying, well, I speak in a certain way, or I pray a certain way, and that is my community. And so I hope that when it comes to philanthropy, at least we try to sort of give everyone the same opportunities that we've been given. And if that's your motivation, hopefully the rest will sort of fall into place.
So it brings me to my next question, which is, over the years, you've seen the regulatory pressures, compliance, and, the restrictions that are placed on the social sector. Year after year, you're seeing that, there's almost like a clampdown on the social sector. And do you think, and this is again from a philanthropy lens, I'm not going to get into a political debate on this. Do you think philanthropists, who have a voice, need to, help the sector be looked at with a more, compassionate, open mind? Because are they doing enough to, because isn't it a hindrance? I mean, this entire, all the regulatory pressures, I see non-profits struggling with more regulatory pressures than, actually creating social impact. So, bridging that gap, I think somewhere those who have the power to, influence need to step up or step in. I mean, what is your point of view on this?
No, I mean, I think there's no question. It is far more difficult from a regulatory perspective to do good as a nonprofit in this country than it is to start a for-profit entity, which does no good. And I think while in the past many years as a country, we've looked at the ease of doing business as an indicator that we all sort of as a country aspire to enhance and move up the ranks. I think a similar emphasis needs to be put on the ease of running an NGO. Right. We have laws that continue to get more and more strict, making it, as you said, Hansel, very, very difficult to run an organization. It takes a day to bring in, or a week maybe, to bring in foreign funds as a for-profit entity, and you go through FEMA and RBI. To bring in foreign funds to do nonprofit work, it takes years, if not decades. I think there's been significant restrictions, as you said, that have been continuously placed on the sector for the last decade. And so, as you said, I don't think it's political in nature. I think we've seen, two governments on the central level in the last 10 years, and equally there's been sort of pressure put. And unfortunately, when you start digging into, the cases that are referred to as why these more restrictive laws are being placed, they're literally 1 in a million. yet it's
Right.
that 1 in a million that affects us all. And so I do think domestic philanthropists have a huge role to play in speaking about this because global philanthropists cannot. There is a fear and a real fear of them getting thrown out of the country if they start sort of politicizing some of these areas. And so I do think domestic philanthropists have a role. We've also seen, though, when some of them have played this role, that does affect their businesses. And so it is a complex issue. But to your point, I think globally, at least, philanthropists do support this, including in the countries that they reside in, even if it's seen as holding the government accountable. But in India, we don't see as much of that. And I think that's where really the everyday giver, those who can give smaller amounts of capital, who are less under risk of coming under that scanner, I think they can actually, make a difference in supporting some of these causes and issues, which are critical to our country.
I mean, I'm going to just take this conversation forward for a brief moment. And I mean, there's to fill this gap, this trust deficit that you see. It almost seems like a trust deficit, that non-profits are seen as people who they're seen as either activists or disruptive forces, or corrupt, or as money laundering. So the variety of things that on social media and in conversations I keep hearing, and I mean, what can we do more to dispel this? And being from the sector, being close to the sector, I know that it is not entirely true. And how do we dispel these myths? I think this silence is, increase. It is widening the trust deficit. It is creating a bigger gap. And how do we mobilize, voices to get this across, that not everybody, not all the apples are rotten.
No, and I think 12 years ago that was our goal when we created the Philanthropy Forum, was to start having these conversations. Unfortunately, from a power perspective, and I say this with full criticism on Dasra and decisions that I've made, we did this at a 5-star hotel. And so invariably, we were limiting those who can participate in these conversations to just a few. Thank God for this pandemic in terms of helping us open source these conversations, in helping us realize that there is a need, to your point, to really expand these dialogues and conversations. And I think for me, in a very small way, the podcast was one of those, I guess, venues or mediums to do that. I think there has been, on the plus side, I guess, many more conversations on philanthropy that exist today, for example, than did exist 12 years ago when we ran and started the philanthropy forums. But again, those conversations are honestly only accessible to a few. And many times, the panel conversations are led more by statistics versus the stories. And I say that because I think it's the stories that actually help bring a level of humility, help ideally bring greater access to anyone who listens to those stories. And clearly you as a filmmaker know this better than anyone else. And so we're hoping through the podcast, at least, that these stories can help people realize that, whether it's Suparna from Ungin, or Donald Lobo, who's a giver in the US, or Vineet Rai, who started Avishkar, that, all of these individuals, while they have created significant impact in this space over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, all of them started again small. All of them, none of them, in fact, had relationships, connections, even PhDs in this area. And so I think hopefully through these conversations, people will realize how accessible the sector really is, and hopefully start convincing others to participate. And again, however shape or form they can participate, but participate wholeheartedly. And clearly more of these conversations need to happen for it to be, mainstream like other sectors are today.
Right. Okay, I'm going to take a slight detour because this can go on and it might, I don't know where it will lead. But what has been your, the most, the people that have influenced you most in these 21 years? I mean, which are the people that you would say have inspired you the most? I know Safina has, but she's watching. So no, I'm joking. So who are the people who've inspired you the most in the past 21 years? Mm,
There have been, honestly, and I say this humbly, every day I get inspired. And it's in that sense been amazing to create, I guess, a career path which allows one to speak to inspirational individuals every single day. And again, given COVID, have not been able to go to the field clearly for a while. But before, just meeting the field staff of NGOs, many of them from the same community that they're trying to support. These community leaders are so inspiring. They didn't wait for, they reached a certain age of their life to start giving back. They didn't wait till they reached a certain bank account balance to start giving back. They took sort of the issues they saw in front of them as their own, and really played a much larger role to sort of make those changes. And so I think the staff of all organizations, I think, inspire me. The communities they support inspire me even more, because they are single-handedly lifting themselves out of poverty. And all NGOs can do are provide somewhat of a level playing field, but really the onus is in those that are uplifting themselves and their families. The NGO leaders, I remember again in 98, 99, sitting in New York at the time and reading over Ashoka Fellow profiles. And so Ashoka is this phenomenal organization that supports NGO leaders with their quest of creating social change. And I remember back then sort of reading profiles of Preeti Patkar, who started in 1986, the first night shelter for children of sex workers here in Mumbai. Reading stories like hers, or Javed Abidi, who sort of took a real stance on ensuring that those with special needs and the disabled have rights in our country, similar to the rights that we have, as well as givers. And I say this because in the last year, at least, we've been working with Anu Aga, Meher, Rati, Forbes, Farhad, and others to really look at how do companies create a stronger, more dignified and equitable social compact with not just their employees, but their contractors and their subcontractors. And I say this because I think, there's, again, decisions that need to be made across the board. And I think we all need to realize that we've also enabled this unjust society to continue. And I think just hearing them, make this core to not just their mission, but bring in their peers of company leaders, of organizations across the country that can start thinking about redefining what it means to be an equitable and fair employer and give livable wages. I think these are some of the conversations that we're having right now. And while we're close to sort of, claiming we've accomplished something, I think even coming to the table, having the humility to accept where we as a society have gone wrong, and then being willing to listen to multiple stakeholders to sort of change the ways, I think are some of the, again, inspirational journeys that I've seen and continue to see on a regular basis.
So, who would you say influenced you the most in these years? I mean, any individual that you can say really influenced your life as we see it now when you look back?
I think, one of the questions that continue to emerge as one works in this space is, are we really creating impact or not? And that is a question that, again, is difficult to define. And I say that is, for those of us who are parents, for example, we may have, like I have, 3 children, and we provide them similar opportunities, yet honestly, what they do with those opportunities differs from child to child. And so there's only so much, I guess, even nonprofits for that matter can do. And I think impact, again, when we're talking about poverty, which is multifaceted, health, education, livelihoods, it's very, very difficult to define impact and what you're trying to do. And the reason I bring this up is what inspires me or keeps me going are those individuals who have lifted themselves out of poverty, who have challenged the norm. And so whether it's Educate Girls or Magic Bus or even a small organization like the Sharanam Center, and I see what those adolescents, or when they were adolescents, what they were able to instill in themselves and what they are doing now in terms of really being community leaders and providing support to those in and around where they live, even in COVID times. And so many of them, again, many NGOs have suffered tremendous losses, and we've had to lay off as a sector employees, we've had to decrease salaries, et cetera. But you see these later leaders that were developed and empowered by these NGOs, they continue to do the work. And so I think for me, it's, and with each organization, there's a few, I guess, individuals that I've been fortunate enough to remain friends with, to speak to see their growth and their opportunity. And I think in a very small way, that defines for me how development actually can work and make a difference. And so I think the crux is really, those individuals that keep me inspired and grounded. At the same time, I think of, them as well to continue to work harder than we have yesterday, because knowing that, again, the need is so great that there's, again, no way we can sort of take a victory lap or say we're done. It is more that, okay, if a solution is working with, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people, even 1 million people for that matter, how does it work for the 250 million adolescents, for example, that we have in our country? And I think what inspires me is not just those adolescents, but all of the NGO leaders, as well as funders, who support these initiatives long term.
Right. So see, one of the things, before we move into the Q&A, the question I really have is, over the years, we have seen, even in Dasra, I've seen a very vibrant, young, set of people working for Dasra. There's this great energy. And around us, you see more and more younger people, compared to people, say, from my generation, a lot of younger people gravitating towards, social change, whether as social entrepreneurs, whether joining the non-profit sector, the social sector, wanting to create an impact. Do you see that happen?
I think we may have lost Hansel, but I heard his question. I do see younger people definitely making purpose part of their career choices. And I think that is fantastic. I think in any sector, you need middle class participation. Because the middle class can participate. Sorry, Hansel, I just lost you, but I was continuing with your question about participation.
Great.
I think there's been a huge shift, I would say, in terms of individuals at a younger age finding purpose to be greater of a commitment than just acquisition of wealth. And I think that is fantastic. And I think the sector has evolved completely in the last 21 years, where people can again support a family and be in the social sector. And I think that's important. And so there's definitely shifts that we are seeing, and not just in India, but globally as well. I think there's just a far greater realization of the issues that exist around us and the desire to sort of help solve those issues in whatever way possible. I think we're also seeing it at a senior level as well. And so we are seeing, people who have 10, 15 years of experience in the corporate sector who are also, making shifts and saying, look, I want to serve. And so I think this is a great step forward. Again, the needs are far more than what even the current human capital that exists in this space. And so we need to increase it. But I think you're seeing more and more of that. And again, examples of, a few of the conversations I've had already with, for example, Suparna from Ungen Trust, the fact that they have been able to get staff to work in different geographies across the country to support the needs of adolescents is fantastic. Or Vineet Rai, who works in impact investing and started Avishkar, which is one of the largest impact investing funds that exist actually globally. And he started that here in India. Again, just looking at their teams and the amount of people that are looking to work for him is fantastic. And in fact, I asked him this on the podcast, and I think his response was also fantastic. Given Vineet was telling kids not to actually join him, but to work with a social entrepreneur, to work with an NGO, to be on the ground, to be in the field, because it's unless you have that real life knowledge of really how change takes place and how difficult it is, only then you should work with groups like Thasra, IntelliCap, Avishkar, et cetera. And I think I was fortunate, as was Neera, to volunteer with NGOs for a while and then sort of say, okay, we kind of know how we could add value. And if possible, I think, many more should do that. Because I think that's critical just to understand exactly what the issues are, and I think more importantly, where you can add value. Because many times, again, as givers of time or resources, we feel like we should be put on a pedestal because we're giving, not realizing that there's serious consequences if we don't give effectively, if we're not able to do our jobs, if we're not actually adding value to the communities we serve. And so I think hopefully through this podcast also we'll have real conversations on is philanthropy, and I think you alluded to this in one of your earlier questions, is it for myself I'm doing this to make me feel good, or is it to actually enable communities to thrive? And I think it's important to always ask ourselves this question, because as I said at the beginning, in the trailer of the podcast, I mean, there are many givers who give because of ego versus empowerment, and I think that also needs to shift.
Right. So I think we should, there are lots of questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to dive in and pick up some of those questions. So, Meera Gorodia from Creative Dignity to Everyone. Her question is, what are the major shifts you see happening in the non-profit sector post the pandemic?
I guess at two or three levels. I guess one, at a funder level, there is a greater realization on the need to support issues, like I said, beyond CSR, but that affect our country as a whole. And so it's unfortunate that we needed this pandemic to help us understand the true value of our informal workforce. But I think there's a true recognition that companies, and again, this is not about the 2%, this is about the 100% of their operations and how they can be more responsible. And I think that is an amazing step forward, especially when their profits have also declined in this time period. And so I think it's, at least the way we sort of discuss this at Thasra, is it's sort of like the movements against child labor, where it is just the right thing to do. And so giving livable wages, providing support to the informal workers who, again, comprise over 90% of our workforce, is so important as companies to sort of take this step back and say, how can they play a role to ensure that India is just a more equitable and just society overall? And in the short run, that may mean a certain amount of percentage points, on your bottom line. But in the long term, it clearly doesn't, because if your employees are safe and secure and healthy, their productivity levels go up as well. And so I think that's one shift, hopefully, that we're seeing. And I think the goal, of course, is that we don't forget about those images of people walking back and how maltreated we have been as a society. And so I think that's one shift. I think with the NGOs, we're seeing, again, depending on the sector, but a clear sort of move to digital where one can be digital. And so, again, it's not a perfect solution and it's not the only solution. And clearly, we all want our children to be back at school. That being said, in education, if digital can supplement what is happening in the school, I think that's a great sort of area that hopefully people will fund and support, as well as on the healthcare side. Hopefully this has demonstrated, the need for telemedicine as well as decentralized solutions. And I think, globally, we've seen those countries that have been most effective in combating this pandemic have been the ones who've sort of decentralized decision making and realized how things need to actually happen at a local level. And so we're hoping at least these kind of views or perspectives continue even after a year or two, all of us have, the vaccine, et cetera.
So yeah, there's a interesting question by Kirti from Godrej. And the question is, if this podcast is attended by people who are already in the space and who know about the space, then how do you see it making a larger difference?
That is a fantastic question. And that is honestly one of the reasons why we decided to have Hansal do this interview. While we've been fortunate to know Hansal for many years, and he actually, attended one of the leadership programs that we run at Dasra years ago, he also has a different market, a different following, a different customer base. And I think the goal is to, again, have these conversations where anyone can sort of listen, enjoy, participate, and have a change of perspective. That is the goal. It's now Hansal's responsibility to make it happen.
So there's Rama Vedula, whose question just came in. Most Indian philanthropies invest more in welfare approaches and few invest in rights-based approaches in a severely marginalizing time like this. How do you see Indian philanthropies motivated to undertake justice, equity, and inclusion agendas?
I mean, we need to clearly invest more in this space. There is a need to support organizations. And so we've seen a few, at least, that have been working on the issue of migrants and informal workers for decades. And because of this COVID and what has happened, I think there's a greater realization, I guess, that these organizations need long-term support. And I think as a society, we need to also realize that in a democracy, rights is not a bad word. In fact, that's what enables us to remain a democracy. And so helping somebody to, for example, access the right to education that's given to their children, or the right to healthcare, or the right to land. These are all things, again, that are testaments to a strong and vibrant democracy. And so I think we need to start having some of those conversations and realize, again, and this is sort of, the ego versus empowerment is critical. And I think what hopefully has happened because of this pandemic, and clearly it's affected me, is around empower communities, enable them to then make those decisions, whatever those decisions may be. And I think many organizations have done a really good job in empowerment, but funding is dried up. And again, for whatever reason, there is a negative connotation when we talk about rights versus a positive connotation. And I say this again, because if we're a democracy, then the rights should be what we're proudest about, and ensuring that everyone has these rights. And so I think this is definitely an area where more funding has to come in. And more individuals need to understand what their rights are and honestly demand their rights. And if that's challenging the status quo, if that's challenging us that have power, if that's challenging, whomever, that's a good thing for any country to have that level of challenge and dialogue.
So there's this question, what have been some major failures or shortcomings in the development sector that you plan to bring to light over the podcast series?
I think, one of them is really related to this question about empowerment. And I say this because even egos don't only sit with philanthropist heads. They can also sit with NGO leaders as well. And so I think just understanding what we can do for communities so they're the ones who are making the decision, not us, I think is really, really important. And again, we do this in our lives. If we have children, after a certain age, we enable them to make decisions, and we should. I think the same doesn't necessarily hold true in the development sector. And so I hope at least all of us start sort of looking at the programs that we support or that we run even, and really questioning, again, is it our ego of this model being replicated across the country as being, what we want to celebrate and talk about scale and be on platforms either in India or globally? Or is it that slightly longer approach of we've empowered communities, and so when we leave, it's actually up to them to make those decisions. And they may or may not be what we have offered them or can provide them, but really that decision lies with them, not with us. And so I hope as a sector, givers and receivers, we start talking about this a little bit more and start challenging, the norms that we've unfortunately established also of at times leaning more towards our ego than empowerment of the communities we serve.
Okay, now this is an interesting question, and this is something that you hear in many debates, even political debates, religious debates. The good Muslim, the bad Muslim. So the good Hindu, the bad Hindu. So in one sentence, what is bad philanthropy, and what is good philanthropy?
I think bad philanthropy is when you think you know the solution, and you don't take time to meet, understand, and be guided by the communities you serve. And I say that because philanthropy is about love for society, as we discussed earlier, and it's about serving. It's not the other way around. And I think too many of givers and receivers at times, again, I think NGO leaders are equally to blame, are more committed on replicating their solution versus understanding from the community what they require. And so I think that's sort of bad philanthropy. I think the flip side, clearly good philanthropy is...
That's Kari, who is reminding me that she wants the answer in one sentence.
One sentence, yes. So it is. Bad philanthropy is, I'll just repeat that one sentence. Bad philanthropy is those who feel they have the answer without consulting and being guided by the communities they serve. I hope that's a run-on sentence, but it's one sentence.
And good philanthropy?
And good philanthropy is realizing that we're lucky to participate, that those who are doing the hard work are those on the ground. And again, we need to give empowerment, flexibility, and ownership of decision to those communities.
Right. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. There's this question from Deepika Allana from the Freedom Fund. Frontline grassroots NGOs are the critical players can do this work. What are the top things that we as foreign funders can do to support frontline grassroots NGOs and help them build the capacity that is sorely needed?
And I think, this goes back to sort of how we started Dasra and volunteering with different NGOs across the country. I think Nir and I saw that while these communities had great solutions and were very dedicated and were willing to uplift themselves and their peers from poverty, I think what we realized is many times that these same communities didn't have the ability to gain different perspectives or build that capability. And so I think capacity building is such a critical aspect of supporting these communities. And again, it's giving them the tools, not giving them the decision. And I think that is such an important thing that all funders, foreign or Indian, can support and needs to support more than we have to ensure when the next pandemic hits, our citizens are not suffering in the way that they have suffered over the last 12 months. And I think that's really, really critical.
Okay, so I think it's time to end. It's 12:30. This has been very, very enriching, Deval. And whenever you write your biography, I'm the first one to ask for filming rights.
Thank you, Ansal, and I really appreciate your time and effort. I hope everyone can subscribe to the podcast wherever you get the podcast. We have it on the chat group. And while Ansal, and this is the only time I can tell you this, but while all of my family, because we're Gujaratis, therefore many of them have been in the stock broker, and there's a poll up, sorry. But while all my family loves your movie, Scam 92 or 3,
1992.
sorry.
1992.
I think you were actually better in the Swiggy ad that you started. and how can I be in a Swiggy ad since Swiggy has kept me going and my family going for the last 12 months?
Well, maybe we should start a non-profit for Swiggy for rural areas. We needed that. We were in a village, and I think we need a Swiggy equivalent across the country, and maybe not for profit.
Great. Thank you so much, Hansal. I really appreciate your friendship and your time.
Thank you, Deval.
Thank you. Bye.
And before going, take part in the poll.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.